It started with a bet. My friends and I, four city kids too cocky for our own good, decided to spend a night deep in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. You've probably heard the legends: the Jersey Devil, ghost lights, shadow people. We laughed them off, of course. We thought we were invincible, that no ghost or devil could mess with us. But I'm here to tell you we were wrong. Dead wrong. The hike out there was uneventful. We parked the car at the edge of the forest, loaded up our gear, and walked for hours until we found the perfect spot. An open clearing surrounded by towering pines. The place was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional sigh of the wind. If we'd been smarter, we would have noticed how unnatural it felt, how the silence seemed to press against your ears like a heavy weight. But we were too busy cracking jokes and setting up camp. The trouble started around sunset. We were sitting around the fire, eating lukewarm hot dogs and talking about urban legends, when Jeremy, the jokester of our group, decided to call out the Jersey Devil. "If you're real," he shouted into the dark, "why don't you show yourself? I bet you're just a lame old story to scare kids." We all laughed, but the forest didn't. The laughter died in my throat as I realized just how still everything had become. Not even the wind rustled the branches. It was like the world had been paused and we were the only things left moving. Then came the smell. Faint at first, like rotting meat, but it grew stronger by the second until we were all gagging and covering our noses. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl vibrating through the ground and straight into my bones. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deep, too unnatural. "Probably a coyote," Matt said, though his voice was shaking. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't show much, just endless trees and shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Then something moved. At first I thought it was just another shadow, but then I saw the eyes. Two glowing red orbs staring at us from the tree line. My blood turned to ice. Whatever it was big, taller than any person, with broad shoulders and a hunched posture. It stepped closer, just enough for the firelight to catch it, and I wished I hadn't seen. It had a face, but not a human one. Its eyes glowed like embers, its skin was leathery and stretched too tight over its skull, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth. It looked like a demon from a nightmare, and it was looking right at me. We ran. I don't remember who screamed first, but the next thing I knew, we were all bolting through the trees, leaving the fire and our gear behind. I could hear it chasing us, its heavy footfalls thudding against the ground, getting closer and closer. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned. But I didn't dare stop. Jeremy tripped. I heard him cry out and turned just in time to see the thing reach him. Its claws were impossibly long, glinting in the faint moonlight. It grabbed him by the leg and dragged him backward, his screams echoing through the forest. Matt and I tried to go back for him, but it was too fast. By the time we reached the spot, there was nothing left but a smear of blood and Jeremy's abandoned flashlight. We didn't stop running until we found an old cabin, half rotted and leaning to one side. It wasn't much, but it had a door we could barricade and a roof to hide under. We shoved a broken table and some chairs against the door, then collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. "What the hell was that thing?" Sarah whispered, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I don't know," Matt said, his hands trembling as he gripped the flashlight. "But it's not human. That much I know." The smell hit us again, stronger this time, like it was right outside. And then we heard it. A slow scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. It was circling the cabin, testing the walls, looking for a way in. Every hair on my body stood on end. "We need to stay quiet," I whispered, but Sarah was already sobbing. I clamped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The thing let out a roar that rattled the walls, and then it started pounding on the door. The wood groaned under the strain, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. In a panic, Matt grabbed a rusted axe he'd found in the corner and swung it at the door just as the creature burst through. The impact sent him flying backward, and the axe clattered to the ground. The thing stepped inside, its massive frame filling the doorway, and I realized this was it. We were going to die here. But then it stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on me, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It tilted its head like it was curious, like it was trying to decide what to do with me. And then it laughed. A horrible, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It reached out with one clawed hand. But before it could grab me, Sarah screamed and threw a burning log from the fire pit at it. The thing roared in pain as the flames caught its arm, and for a split second, we saw our chance. We bolted out the door and into the forest, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't speak on the drive back. Jeremy was gone, and there was no way to explain what had happened without sounding insane. We agreed to never talk about it again, to never go back to that cursed forest. But I can't stop thinking about the way it looked at me, the way it laughed like it knew something I didn't. I still hear that laugh sometimes, in the dead of night when everything is quiet, and every now and then I catch a whiff of that terrible smell, even when I'm miles away from the forest. I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I'm terrified it's not finished with me yet.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. A group of us, 5 in total, had rented a remote cabin in the middle of the Appalachian forest. No phones, no internet, no distractions. Just the woods, a stocked fridge, and some beer. Perfect, right? Except, looking back, none of us really thought to ask why the rental was so cheap. The first night was fine. We drank, told ghost stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. The only strange thing was the basement door. It had a heavy padlock on it and a note taped above that read, "Do not open, for your safety." Naturally, Jeremy, the boldest of us, couldn't stop making jokes about it. "What's down there, a treasure chest? A body? Bigfoot's summer home?" he said, shaking the lock. "Maybe it's just an old storage room," Kara replied, but even she sounded unsure. Something about the note made us all uneasy. We brushed it off, though. None of us wanted to be the one to admit we were freaked out. That night, we went to bed in our separate rooms, laughing about how weird notes didn't scare us. The first scream came at 3 a.m. I jolted awake, heart pounding. It was Beth, the most level-headed of the group. She came running into the living room where I'd been sleeping on the pull-out couch, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Something's in my room," she whispered, voice shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked, sitting up. "I don't know. I heard scratching, like nails on the walls, and when I turned on the light, it stopped. But I swear I saw something move in the corner. Maybe it's a raccoon or something," I offered, though my stomach was already in knots. These cabins probably aren't sealed up tight. By now, the others had come out of their rooms. Jeremy was annoyed, rubbing his eyes. "You're freaking out over nothing," he muttered. "It's just an old house. They creak. Relax." But none of us could relax after that. We sat in the living room, huddled together, waiting for dawn. At some point, we must have dozed off because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, everything seemed normal. I almost convinced myself that Beth had imagined the whole thing. And then we noticed the scratches. They were on the walls, deep and jagged, as if something with claws had raked them in the dead of night. Jeremy still tried to brush it off. "It's just an animal," he said. "We'll report it to the rental company when we leave." He sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than us. But Beth wasn't having it. "Animals don't write," she said, pointing to the message scratched into the wood near the basement door. "Let me out." We stared at it in silence. The letters were uneven, jagged, like they'd been carved in a frenzy. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. That's when we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the locked basement door. "Nope," Kara said, grabbing her bag. "I'm leaving. I don't care if I have to hike 10 miles back to town." But when we opened the front door, we froze. The porch was covered in dirt, leaves, and claw marks that hadn't been there the day before. Worse, the path back to the car was blocked by fallen trees. It didn't make sense. There'd been no storm, no wind strong enough to bring down trees that size. "We're trapped," Beth whispered. Jeremy, trying to mask his fear, grabbed a crowbar from the shed. "Fine. If something's in that basement, we're going to deal with it. I'm not sitting around waiting for some psycho or animal to pick us off one by one." We all protested, but he wasn't listening. Before we knew it, he'd broken the padlock. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. A cold, damp smell wafted up, making me gag. "Stay up here if you're scared," Jeremy said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll check it out." We didn't want him to go alone, so we reluctantly followed. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of rot grew stronger. By the time we reached the bottom, I was shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out. The basement was wrong. The walls were lined with what looked like ancient symbols drawn in some kind of reddish-brown substance that I didn't want to identify. In the center of the room was a crude stone altar, stained dark and surrounded by melted candles. "What the hell is this?" Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. We all screamed, running back up the steps, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like something or someone was holding it shut. And then the whispers started. They came from all around us, soft at first, then louder, overlapping, like 100 voices speaking at once. The words weren't in English or any language I recognized, but they dripped with malice. "Turn off the flashlight," Beth hissed. "Whatever it is, maybe it can't see us if it's dark." Jeremy reluctantly clicked it off, plunging us into complete darkness. We stood there, huddled together, listening to the whispers grow closer. My breath caught as something brushed against my leg, cold and wet, like a decayed hand. I bit back a scream as a low growl rumbled through the room. It wasn't human and it wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. Then we heard it. The scrape of claws on the stairs. It was coming for us. In the chaos, I grabbed the flashlight from Jeremy and turned it back on. The beam caught something at the bottom of the stairs, something tall, hunched, and grotesque. Its eyes gleamed like polished stones, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin filled with jagged teeth. "Run!" I screamed. We didn't need to be told twice. We shoved against the door with all our strength, and somehow, maybe out of sheer desperation, it finally gave way. We scrambled out, slamming it shut behind us. Jeremy jammed the crowbar through the handle to keep it closed, though I wasn't sure it would hold. The whispers stopped, but the cabin felt different, colder, darker. We grabbed our bags and ran for the woods, fallen trees be damned. We didn't stop until we reached the highway, where a trucker finally picked us up and drove us to the nearest town. We reported what had happened, but no one believed us. They said the cabin didn't exist, that there was no record of any rental in that area. But I know what I saw. We all do. Sometimes late at night, I hear those whispers again, faint and distant. I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to make the mistake we did, and I'll never set foot in those woods again.
Story number 3.
We were just looking for a place to hang out, a secluded spot where no one would bother us. That's how we ended up in the old Crow's Hollow Asylum, deep in the backwoods of West Virginia. Everyone in town knew about it, whispered stories of the screams people claimed to hear at night, of shadows moving in the windows long after the place was abandoned. We thought it was all nonsense, just urban legends meant to keep kids like us away. So naturally, we went. It was me, my best friend Nate, his girlfriend Lila, and her brother Chris. We were armed with flashlights, a bag of snacks, and Nate's Bluetooth speaker, blasting a playlist of 80s rock. The asylum loomed over us as we approached, its windows dark, its walls covered in graffiti. It looked exactly like the kind of place you shouldn't go, but that just made it cooler. The front door was boarded up, but Chris found a window already broken. We climbed inside, stepping into what used to be the main lobby. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Our flashlights illuminated crumbling walls, overturned furniture, and torn medical curtains that swayed slightly in the still air. "Creepy," Lila said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "You guys sure this was a good idea?" "Come on, it's just an old building," Nate said, grinning. "Don't tell me you believe all those ghost stories." "I don't," she muttered, but I noticed the way she clung to his arm. We wandered deeper into the asylum, our footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. Every sound seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards, every drip of water echoing through the halls. At first, it was kind of fun. We joked about finding a ghost or getting lost in the maze of hallways. But then the atmosphere started to shift. It began subtly. The temperature dropped, making our breath visible in the beams of our flashlights. The air grew heavier, as if the building itself were pressing down on us. And then there was the feeling, that awful, crawling sensation at the back of your neck, like you're being watched. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Chris asked, stopping in his tracks. "Hear what?" Nate said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Shh," Chris said, holding up a hand. We all went silent, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. That's just the sound of our own breathing. And then, faint and distant, came the unmistakable sound of laughter. High-pitched and childlike, it echoed down the hallway, sending a shiver straight down my spine. "Okay, that's creepy," Lila whispered. "It's probably just the wind," Nate said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We kept walking, though none of us were joking anymore. The laughter faded, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. It was like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then we found the room. It was at the end of a long hallway, its door slightly ajar. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong, like it was darker than the rest of the asylum, but we were too curious to turn back. Nate pushed the door open, and our flashlights swept over the interior. The walls were covered in writing, words scratched into the paint, overlapping and illegible like they'd been carved in a frenzy. The floor was littered with old medical instruments, rusted scalpels, broken syringes, shattered glass, and in the center of the room was a wheelchair, its back to us, as if someone had just been sitting in it. "Okay, let's leave," Lila said, backing toward the door. "Wait," Nate said, shining his flashlight on the wheelchair. "What's that?" He pointed to something on the seat, a small stuffed rabbit. Its fur was gray with age, its button eyes missing, leaving only empty sockets. "Creepy toy," Chris muttered. "Let's go." But Nate wasn't listening. He stepped forward, reaching out to pick up the rabbit. "Nate, don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Relax," he said, snatching it up. "It's just a..." Before he could finish, the door slammed shut behind us. Lila screamed, and I spun around, shining my flashlight at the door. There was no one there. "What the hell?" Chris shouted, tugging at the handle. It wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut. And then the laughter returned. Louder this time, and closer. It echoed around us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the beam stabilized, my heart nearly stopped. The wheelchair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, a child, or what looked like one. Its head hung low, its body limp, as if it were asleep. Its clothes were tattered, stained with something dark. But its face wasn't right. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its skull, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "Run!" I screamed, but none of us could move. The thing lifted its head slowly, its mouth curling into a grin far too wide for its face. Then it stood. It didn't move like a child. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, its head twitching to the side with a sickening crack. And then it lunged. We scattered, screaming, each of us bolting in a different direction. I didn't even know which way I was running. I just wanted to get away. The laughter followed me, louder and more distorted, echoing in my ears. I found myself in another hallway, but it didn't look like the one we'd come through. The walls were decayed, oozing some kind of dark, viscous liquid. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air reeked of decay. I turned a corner and stopped dead. Nate was there, standing with his back to me. "Nate!" I whispered, relief flooding through me. I ran up to him, grabbing his shoulder. "We have to." He turned, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't Nate. It looked like him, but his eyes were black, and his mouth was stretched into that same unnatural grin. He tilted his head, and in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I screamed and ran, tears streaming down my face. I didn't stop until I burst through the broken window we'd come in through, collapsing onto the ground outside. Chris and Lila were already there, pale and shaking. "Nate?" I asked, but they just shook their heads. We waited until sunrise before driving back to town. We never saw Nate again. The police searched the asylum, but they didn't find anything. No wheelchair, no writing, no sign of him. But I know what I saw. I know what took him. And I know it's still in there, waiting for someone else to walk through that door.
Story number 4.
I grew up in a small town nestled against the edge of a sprawling forest. It wasn't just any forest, though. It was Blackthorn Woods, a place steeped in fear and folklore. My mom used to warn me and my brother Evan about going in there. "People don't come back from Blackthorn," she'd say. "Stay out no matter what." We listened, for the most part. The woods always had a strange pull, though. There was something about their dark, twisted trees and the heavy silence that made them feel alive. And when you're a teenager, the promise of something forbidden is hard to resist. One crisp autumn evening, Evan and I were hanging out in our backyard when we saw a faint glow in the distance, deep within the forest. It flickered like firelight, and curiosity got the better of us. "Probably just some campers," I said. "Out there? No one camps in Blackthorn," Evan replied, a nervous edge to his voice. "Not unless they're crazy." "Let's check it out," I said, grabbing a flashlight before he could argue. Evan hesitated, but eventually followed. He always did. The moment we stepped into the woods, the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, as if the trees were holding their breath. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but it barely seemed to penetrate the shadows. As we moved closer to the light, it became clear it wasn't a campfire. It was a lantern, swaying gently from the branch of an ancient oak. Beneath it was a small, weathered stone circle etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The air around it felt electric, almost alive. "Let's go back," Evan whispered, his voice trembling. But before I could reply, the lantern's flame flared, bright enough to make us shield our eyes. When it dimmed again, the forest wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood inside the stone circle. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long and thin. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could see its eyes. Hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the silence around it felt deafening. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Evan's arm. We turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise we made. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting chaotic shadows that made the forest seem alive. I don't know how far we ran before I dared to look back. The figure wasn't behind us, but the forest had changed. The path we'd come in on was gone, replaced by a tangle of gnarled trees and thorny bushes. My chest tightened. "We're lost," Evan said, panic rising in his voice. "No, I stopped, shining the flashlight around. There was no trail, no familiar landmarks, just endless trees. And then I noticed something worse. The lantern was ahead of us again. It hung from another tree, its light flickering as if mocking us. Beneath it, the stone circle had reappeared, identical to the one we'd just run from. And the figure was there too, its head tilted as if it were watching us. "This isn't real," I said, backing away. "It can't be." Evan grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "We have to keep moving." We turned again, running blindly through the woods. But no matter how far or fast we ran, the lantern kept finding us. Every time we thought we'd lost it, it would appear ahead, the figure waiting silently beneath its glow. At some point, we realized the woods weren't just dark, they were changing. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't looking, their branches forming twisted, skeletal shapes. The ground grew soft and spongy, and the air was filled with the faint sound of whispers, just on the edge of hearing. "Do you hear that?" Evan asked, his voice barely audible. "Don't listen to it," I said, though I could already feel the whispers worming into my mind, filling my head with strange, fragmented images. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, all drenched in a suffocating sense of dread. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and its windows broken. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but it was the first real shelter we'd seen. "We'll hide in there," I said, pulling Evan toward it. The cabin's interior was worse than I expected. The walls were covered in scratches, like something had tried to claw its way out. The floor was littered with bones, small ones like they belonged to animals, though I wasn't entirely sure. We barricaded the door with an old rotting table and sat in the corner, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. "What is this place?" Evan whispered. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we'll stay here until morning. Once it's light, we'll find our way out." But morning never came. The lantern appeared outside the window first, its glow illuminating the cabin's interior with an eerie, golden light. The figure was there too, standing just outside the door. It didn't knock, didn't try to get in. It just waited, its hollow eyes fixed on us. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. They weren't just outside, they were in the cabin, in my head. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The words were clearer now, though they weren't in English. They were harsh, guttural, but I understood them somehow. They were calling our names. "I can't take it anymore," Evan said, standing suddenly. "I have to get out of here." "No." I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off. He ran to the door, shoving the table aside and threw it open. The lantern's light flared, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, Evan was gone. I stumbled outside, screaming his name, but the forest swallowed my voice. The lantern had vanished, and the stone circle was empty. I was alone. I don't know how I found my way out of the woods. One moment I was wandering through the trees, and the next I was stumbling onto the road at the forest's edge, half mad with terror. They never found Evan. I told the police everything, but they said he'd probably just gotten lost, that he might turn up eventually. But I know the truth. Blackthorn Woods took him. Whatever lives there, whatever we saw, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. And some nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear the whispers.
Story number 5.
The small Appalachian town where I grew up had a rule: never go near Hollow Creek after dark. It wasn't a law, but it might as well have been. Everyone in town knew the stories, the strange disappearances, the chilling screams that echoed through the forest on moonless nights, and the legend of the shadow woman who supposedly haunted the area. I didn't believe in any of it. Neither did my cousin, Eric. We were teenagers, cocky and bored, and we'd heard the stories so many times that they lost their power to scare us. So one cool October night, we decided to prove everyone wrong. "We'll camp near the creek," Eric said, grinning as he stuffed a flashlight into his backpack. "Spend the night. Come morning, we'll have the perfect story to rub in everyone's faces." I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to seem scared, so I agreed. That evening, we grabbed our gear and headed into the woods. The hike to Hollow Creek took about an hour. The trees were thick and gnarled, their branches twisting together to block out most of the moonlight. By the time we reached the water, the air felt heavier, colder. The creek itself was shallow, its dark surface barely moving, as if the water were frozen in time. "This is it?" I asked, trying to hide my disappointment. It looked ordinary, like any other forest stream. Eric shrugged. "Maybe we have to wait for midnight or something." That's when the scary stuff always happens, right? We set up a small camp a few yards from the creek and built a fire. The flames crackled, casting long shadows across the trees. For a while, we laughed, told jokes, and shared snacks, the eerie stories about the creek feeling distant and silly. But as the night wore on, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to wrap around us. The fire flickered, and I swore the shadows it cast looked wrong. "You feel that?" I asked Eric, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his grin fading. "Yeah, it's colder." Then we heard it. A faint sound like humming drifted through the trees. It was soft, melodic, and entirely out of place. Eric and I exchanged a glance, our bravado slipping away. "Probably just the wind," Eric said, but his voice cracked. The humming grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low and mournful, like a lullaby sung by someone who'd forgotten the words. It sent chills racing down my spine. "Let's pack up," I said, standing abruptly. "We've proved our point. Let's go." Before Eric could respond, the fire went out. Just like that. One moment it was crackling, the next it was gone, leaving us in complete darkness. "Eric," I whispered, fumbling for my flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. "Eric, where are you?" "I'm here," he said, but his voice sounded wrong, distant and hollow, like it was coming from underwater. I managed to find the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but Eric wasn't where I'd last seen him. Instead, he was standing at the edge of the creek, staring into the water. "Eric, what are you doing?" I hissed, running toward him. He didn't answer. His head was tilted slightly, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. His lips moved as if he were whispering, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I grabbed his arm, shaking him hard. "Eric!" He turned to look at me, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were completely black, like twin voids. His face was pale, almost translucent, and when he opened his mouth to speak, it wasn't his voice that came out. "She's here!" Before I could react, something moved in the water. The creek, which had been still moments before, now rippled violently. A dark figure rose from its depths, taller than any person should be. Its body was a shifting mass of shadows, its edges flickering like smoke, and its face, or what passed for a face, was nothing but a jagged smile, glowing faintly in the dark. The Shadow Woman. She stepped onto the bank, her form solidifying slightly, though she still seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Her head tilted as she looked at Eric, then at me. The humming resumed, louder now, and I felt it reverberate through my chest like a second heartbeat. Eric started walking toward her. "No!" I yelled, grabbing him by the shoulders. He was strong, unnaturally strong, and it took everything I had to hold him back. His black eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the old Eric beneath them. "Don't let me go," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Don't." The Shadow Woman raised one hand, and the air seemed to ripple around her. The force of it sent me flying backwards, slamming into a tree. My vision blurred, and when I managed to focus again, Eric was gone. The woman stood alone on the creek's edge, her shadowy form towering over me. Her smile widened as she turned toward me, and the humming became a cacophony of whispers. Words I couldn't understand filled my ears, my head, my very soul. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly into the forest. The shadows seemed to reach for me, clawing at my clothes and skin. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to drag me back. I don't remember how I made it out. One moment I was running, and the next I was stumbling onto the main road, gasping for air. The townspeople found me at dawn, shivering and incoherent. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said Eric must have fallen into the creek, that the currents must have taken him. But I know the truth. I still hear the humming sometimes, faint and distant, especially when I'm near water. And sometimes when I'm alone, I see her in my dreams, her shadowy form flickering, her jagged smile glowing in the dark, and I hear Eric's voice calling out from somewhere far away, like begging me not to let go.
Story number 6.
It started with a dare, as these things often do. My friends and I were gathered around a bonfire in my backyard, the cool October air crackling with the promise of mischief. Someone, probably Max, who always pushed things too far, brought up Briar Ridge, the desolate stretch of forest at the edge of town. "You know the legend, right?" he said, his grin illuminated by the flickering flames. "The bone collector?" "Oh, come on," I groaned. "That's just some made-up crap to keep kids out of the woods." "Is it, though?" Max leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say he's still out there, a guy who went crazy, living in the woods, luring people in, and..." "And what?" Kelly interrupted, rolling her eyes. "Turning them into skeletons? Please." "Prove me wrong," Max shot back. "I dare you to go out there, spend the night." That's how I ended up in Briar Ridge at midnight with Max, Kelly, and my younger brother, Will. None of us really believed in the bone collector, but the thrill of the unknown and the chance to prove Max wrong was enough to get us out there. The forest was dark, even with the full moon overhead. The trees were twisted and ancient, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The path was narrow, overgrown with weeds, and the deeper we went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional snap of a twig. "You scared yet?" Max teased, shining his flashlight in my face. "Hardly," I said, swatting the beam away. But truth be told, something about the woods felt wrong. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Will stayed close to me, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. After about an hour, we reached a clearing. In the center was a crumbling stone structure, more of a ruin than a building. It looked like it had once been a small cabin, but now it was just a skeleton of rotting wood and stone walls. "This is it," Max declared. "Bone collector's lair." Kelly snorted. "Looks more like a pile of garbage." But as we stepped closer, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and an earthy metallic scent filled my nose, like rust and decay. Will tugged at my sleeve. "Do you smell that?" "Yeah," I muttered, my stomach turning. "Stay close." Inside the ruin, the ground was littered with debris, old bottles, scraps of fabric, and what looked like animal bones. I hoped they were animal bones anyway. In one corner, a pile of stones formed a crude hearth with ashes that looked suspiciously fresh. "This is so stupid," Kelly said, kicking at the ashes. "There's nothing here. Let's make it interesting," Max said, pulling a tattered notebook from his backpack. "Everyone write something down. Something secret. We'll leave it here, and the bone collector will know we were here." "That's dumb," I said, but Max was already scribbling something in the notebook. He handed it to Kelly, who rolled her eyes but played along. Will hesitated when it was his turn, but Max pressured him into it. Finally, the notebook landed in my hands. "Seriously?" I said, flipping through the pages. The scrawled handwriting looked ridiculous in the eerie moonlight, but something about the act of leaving secrets in a place like this felt wrong. Still, I wrote something down, something small, just to get it over with, and tossed the notebook onto the ashes. "Now what?" Kelly asked, crossing her arms. "Now we wait," Max said, grinning, "and see if anything happens." For a while, nothing did. We sat in the clearing, the silence pressing in from all sides, but then Will noticed something. "The bones," he said, his voice shaking. "They've moved." "What are you talking about?" I asked, shining my flashlight on the ground. Sure enough, the bones scattered around the ruin had shifted. They were no longer random. They were arranged, forming strange, spiraling patterns. "That wasn't like that before," Kelly said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Max laughed nervously. "Okay, who's messing with us? Did one of you?" A loud crack cut him off. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods, like the sound of a branch snapping under something heavy. We all froze. "What was that?" Will whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. The crack came again, closer this time. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it toward the edge of the clearing. The trees stood silent and menacing, their shadows shifting like living things. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the woods. At first, I thought it was just a man. But as it stepped into the moonlight, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body wrapped in tattered, filthy rags. Its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured by a mask made of bone, crudely tied together with strips of leather. In its hands, it carried a long, gnarled staff, adorned with bits of bone and tufts of fur. The metallic scent grew stronger, almost suffocating as it moved closer. "Run," I whispered, but no one moved. We were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the thing in front of us. The figure tilted its head, as if studying us. Then it raised its staff and slammed it into the ground. The sound reverberated through the clearing like a thunderclap, and suddenly the forest came alive. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, writhing and twisting like smoke. The spirals of bones on the ground began to shift, sliding together as if pulled by invisible strings. One of the piles rose, forming the shape of a hand, skeletal and impossibly large. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Will and shoving him toward the trees. We ran. Branches clawed at our faces, roots tripped our feet, but we didn't stop. Behind us, I could hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of the figure, its staff pounding the ground in a steady rhythm. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in tighter with every step. I glanced back and saw Max stumble, his flashlight flying from his hand. "Help!" he screamed, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop. Will's hand was in mine, and I dragged him forward, tears streaming down my face. Max's screams were cut short, replaced by a wet, sickening crunch. Kelly was ahead of us, sobbing as she ran, but the shadows were faster. They surged forward, engulfing her in an instant. "Don't look back," I told Will, though my voice was barely a whisper. Somehow, we made it out of the woods. We stumbled onto the road, gasping for air, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, but we were alone. Max and Kelly were gone. The police searched the woods the next day, but they didn't find anything. No bones, no ruins, just an empty forest. They said Max and Kelly must have gotten lost, that we'd imagined the rest. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the sound of bones rattling, faint and distant. And I know the bone collector is still out there, waiting for his next victims.
Story number 7.
I had always heard the stories about Silent Pines, the stretch of forest just outside our little town. People said it was cursed, a place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred. Over the years, hikers had vanished without a trace, and locals whispered about the Watcher, an entity that lived among the trees, unseen but always present. I never believed in the stories. They seemed like campfire tales, meant to spook kids and keep them from wandering too far. That was until my best friend, Mia, went missing there. Mia had been adventurous, fearless, in a way that often left me in awe. A few weeks ago, she told me she was going to explore Silent Pines alone. She laughed off my concerns, even when I reminded her about the stories. "Come on, Lily," she said with a grin. "I'll be fine. They're just stories." But she didn't come back. The search parties found no trace of her. No footprints, no gear, nothing. It was like she'd walked into the woods and vanished. Her parents were devastated. I was heartbroken. And I couldn't stop the nagging guilt that it should have been me trying to stop her, that maybe I could have done more. One sleepless night, I made a decision. I had to find her. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe some kind of sign, a clue about what had happened. Whatever it was, I couldn't sit by anymore. Armed with a flashlight, a map, and a fading sense of courage, I headed into Silent Pines. The moment I stepped under the canopy of trees, I felt it. The weight of the forest pressing down on me. The air was heavy, unnaturally still. Even the wind didn't seem to penetrate the dense foliage. Every step I took felt wrong, like the forest didn't want me there. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't just quiet. It was absolute, as if the forest had swallowed every sound. My own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots were deafening in the stillness. "Mia?" I called, my voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. It echoed strangely, bouncing off the trees in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt eyes on me, though I saw no movement. An hour passed, maybe 2. I wasn't sure anymore. Time seemed to stretch, the forest twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The path I'd followed was gone, replaced by dense thickets and unfamiliar clearings. The map was useless, and then I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, half hidden by the trees. My heart leapt. "Mia!" I shouted, running toward it. As I got closer, my excitement turned to confusion. It wasn't Mia. It wasn't even human. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and a featureless face that seemed to ripple like water. It stood completely still, its head tilted slightly as if it were listening. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed deeper into the woods. Then it was gone, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to follow. Maybe it was leading me to Mia. Or maybe I was already lost, and this thing, whatever it was the only way to find my way out. Either way, I didn't have much choice. The forest grew darker as I followed the direction it had pointed. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams that barely penetrated the gloom. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a clearing. In the center was a massive oak tree, its bark blackened and scarred. At its base was a small pile of objects, a torn backpack, a crumpled water bottle, a shoe. My stomach twisted. They were Mia's. I ran to the pile, dropping to my knees. "Mia!" I screamed, my voice cracking. Tears blurred my vision as I sifted through the items, desperate for some sign of her. But there was nothing, just her belongings, abandoned like offerings at the base of the tree. And then I felt it, a presence. I turned slowly, and there it was, the Watcher. This time it was closer, towering over me. Its featureless face seemed to shift, forming vague impressions of eyes and a mouth that didn't quite stay in place. It leaned forward, impossibly long arms stretching toward me. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the tree. My flashlight flickered out completely, plunging the clearing into darkness. The only light came from the Watcher itself, a faint, sickly glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "Where is she?" I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The Watcher tilted its head again, the gesture almost curious. Then it raised one hand and pointed upward. I looked, and my heart stopped. Hanging from the branches of the oak tree were dozens of figures, their forms wrapped in twisted roots and vines. They swayed gently, as if moved by a non-existent breeze, and among them I saw her, Mia. Her face was pale, her eyes open but unseeing. The roots coiled around her limbs, anchoring her to the tree like some grotesque marionette. I screamed her name, but she didn't respond. She was too still, too quiet. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "No, no, no." The Watcher stepped closer, its glowing form looming over me. Its shifting face came inches from mine, and I felt a cold, suffocating dread wash over me. The whispers started then, soft at first but growing louder, voices overlapping in a language I didn't understand. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whispers filled my head, pushing out every thought, every ounce of reason. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the Watcher reaching for me. I woke up on the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. My clothes were torn, my hands scratched and bleeding. Mia's belongings were scattered around me, but she was nowhere to be found. I stumbled back to town, half mad with grief and terror. When I told the authorities what I'd seen, they looked at me like I'd lost my mind. They chalked it up to trauma, said I must have imagined it all. But I know what I saw. The Watcher is real, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows of silent pines. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers. They call my name, soft and insistent, beckoning me back to the forest.
Story number 8.
I had never been much of a believer in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, and curses, none of it seemed real to me. That is, until the night I spent at Ravenwood Asylum, the abandoned mental hospital just outside of town. Everyone knew the place was trouble. Teens dared each other to go in, local historians warned about its dark past, and some even claimed to have heard screams echoing from the building long after it had been shuttered. But to me, it was just an old, rotting building, until it wasn't. It was Halloween night, and my friends had decided we should do something thrilling, something memorable. That's how I found myself standing at the rusted iron gates of Ravenwood, flashlight in hand, with my two best friends, Sarah and Ethan, at my side. "Ready for this?" Ethan asked, grinning in that cocky way he always did when he knew we were about to do something stupid. "I still think this is a bad idea," Sarah muttered, hugging her arms to her chest. She was always the cautious one, but even she didn't want to be the only one to back out. "We're just going in for a look," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "A quick walk around, maybe take some pictures, and then we're out. No big deal." Ethan pushed open the gates with a groan of rusted hinges, and we stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the asylum. The building loomed ahead of us, its jagged silhouette cutting into the night sky. The windows were shattered, the walls stained with years of weather and neglect. Vines crept up its sides like veins, and the front doors hung slightly ajar, beckoning us in. "Creepy as hell," Sarah whispered. "Perfect," Ethan said with a grin. "Let's go." Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the musty scent of decay. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the cavernous halls, as if the building itself were alive and listening. Graffiti covered the walls, mingling with peeling paint and rust stains. Doors hung off their hinges, revealing empty rooms filled with broken furniture and debris. "People actually lived here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Patients," Ethan corrected. "And not just any patients, the worst of the worst. This place wasn't just a hospital. It was a prison for the criminally insane." "Great," Sarah muttered. "Just what I wanted to think about." We wandered deeper into the building, our flashlights casting long, shifting shadows. Ethan, ever the thrill-seeker, led the way, while Sarah and I trailed behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, sure I'd see something, or someone, following us. But the halls were always empty. We found ourselves in what must have been the main treatment wing. The air was colder here, and the walls were lined with old, rusted gurneys and medical equipment. One room still had a chair bolted to the floor, its leather straps cracked and frayed. "Look at this," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "It's like something out of a horror movie." "I don't think we should be here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it feels wrong." "Come on," Ethan said, rolling his eyes. "It's just a building. What's it going to do, fall on us?" Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed through the halls. We froze, our flashlights darting toward the source of the noise. It had come from somewhere nearby, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Probably just an animal," Ethan said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Or, the wind. We decided to keep moving, though the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of floorboards, the drip of water from somewhere unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, that something in the asylum didn't want us there. We reached the end of the hallway and found a set of stairs leading down to the basement. Ethan's eyes lit up. "This is where they kept the worst patients," he said. "The ones who were too dangerous to be with the others." "No way," Sarah said, backing away. "I'm not going down there." "Oh, come on," Ethan said. "Don't you want to see the real scary stuff?" I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay upstairs, but I didn't want to leave Ethan alone, and I didn't want him calling me a coward for the rest of my life. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Fine," I said, "but just for a minute." Sarah reluctantly followed, clinging to my arm as we descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. Our flashlights barely cut through it, their beams flickering as if the batteries were dying. The basement was worse than I imagined. The walls were lined with rows of small, windowless cells, their heavy iron doors ajar. The air smelled of mildew and something sharper, like old blood. The silence down here was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our breathing. "This is messed up," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Ethan stepped into one of the cells, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. "Look at this," he said, pointing. "Someone carved into the walls." I stepped closer and saw what he meant. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that formed unintelligible patterns. Some of the marks looked almost like words, though they were in no language I recognized. "Let's go," Sarah said, pulling at my arm. "I'm serious, Lily. I don't want to be here anymore." Before I could respond, the door to the cell slammed shut with a deafening clang. Ethan spun around, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he shouted. "Did you do that?" "No," I yelled. Rushing to the door, I tried to pull it open, but it was like it had been welded shut. Inside the cell, Ethan's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. And then we heard it. A low, guttural moan echoed through the basement, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. My blood turned to ice. The sound was coming from the hallway, moving toward us. "Someone's here," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "We need to go." "We can't leave Ethan," I said, pounding on the cell door. "Ethan, hold on. We'll get you out." But Ethan wasn't listening. His flashlight had gone out completely, and the cell was pitch black. I could hear him breathing heavily, muttering something under his breath. "Ethan, talk to me," I yelled. "What's going on?" "The walls," he whispered. "They're moving." Before I could process what he said, the footsteps grew louder. Sarah grabbed my arm, dragging me down the hall. "We have to go, Lily. Now." I didn't want to leave Ethan, but the footsteps were too close, the moaning growing louder, more guttural. We ran, our flashlights barely illuminating the path ahead. Behind us, I heard Ethan scream, a sound so raw and primal that it didn't even sound human. We didn't stop running until we were out of the asylum, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. We turned back, expecting to see something chasing us, but the building was still and silent, its broken windows staring back like empty eyes. Ethan was never found. The police searched the asylum, but found no trace of him, no sign that anyone had even been in the basement. They said it was an accident, that he must have gotten lost or fallen somewhere we didn't see. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same guttural moan, faint and distant, and sometimes I think I see shadows moving where they shouldn't, shapes that don't belong. Ravenwood didn't just take Ethan, it marked us, and I don't think it's done with me yet.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway from the grind of city life. My girlfriend, Elena, and I had found a remote spot deep in the forests of Washington. The online reviews called it peaceful, serene, and untouched. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and breathe fresh air under the canopy of ancient trees. We didn't realize the forest had other plans. The drive out there was uneventful, but as soon as we left the paved roads for the dirt path leading to the campsite, I started to feel uneasy. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted like the fingers of some ancient being. They seemed to crowd the road, their branches reaching down as if trying to snatch us up. I told myself I was just imagining things. Forests always felt a little eerie when you weren't used to them. We arrived in the late afternoon, and everything seemed normal enough. The campsite was secluded, with a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. A fire pit sat in the center, and there was even a makeshift log bench someone had left behind. We set up our tent and unloaded our gear as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "This is perfect," Elena said, smiling as she lit the campfire. I forced a grin and nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest was too quiet, no bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional sigh of the wind through the trees. As night fell, the unease grew. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. Elena and I shared stories and roasted marshmallows, trying to enjoy the moment, but my eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. "Do you hear that?" I asked suddenly, interrupting Elena mid-sentence. "Hear what?" she asked, frowning. I strained my ears. There it was again, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the woods. It wasn't the wind or the crackling fire. It was deliberate, like someone or something knocking on wood. "It's probably just a woodpecker," Elena said, though she didn't sound convinced. I nodded, trying to dismiss it, but the tapping continued, slow and methodical, growing louder with each passing minute. Then it stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. We decided to call it a night, retreating into the safety of our tent. Elena fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch outside made me jump. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Bears, wolves, or worse. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched refused to leave me. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The tapping, but this time it was closer, much closer. It sounded like it was coming from just outside the tent. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Elena," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Elena, wake up." She groaned, half asleep. "What is it?" "Listen," I said. She froze, her eyes widening as the tapping continued. It was steady and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the tent, as if circling us. "Do you think it's an animal?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't know. Grabbing the flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. The tapping stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence was absolute. After what felt like an eternity, I zipped the tent closed and sat back. "Probably just the wind," I lied. Elena didn't look convinced, but she nodded and lay back down. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, we found strange marks in the dirt around the campsite, circles, spirals, and symbols I didn't recognize, as if someone had drawn them with a stick. They were too deliberate to be an accident, and they hadn't been there the day before. "What the hell is this?" Elena asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I said, my stomach nodding. Maybe some kids messing around? Out here? In the middle of nowhere? I didn't have an answer. The marks set me on edge, but I didn't want to scare Elena more than she already was. We decided to pack up and leave. Whatever sense of adventure we'd had was long gone. As we loaded the car, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker. Every sound made me flinch, and I had the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. We drove in tense silence, the dirt road winding endlessly through the forest. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the sunlight. The GPS lost signal, and the road grew rougher, the tires crunching over loose rocks. Then we saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, motionless. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs and a head that seemed too small for its body. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over its bony frame. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow pits. Elena screamed, and I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from the figure. For a moment, it didn't move. Then it tilted its head, as if studying us. "Reverse," Elena hissed, gripping my arm. "Reverse now!" I threw the car into reverse, but the figure moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. It darted to the side, disappearing into the trees. "We have to go," Elena said, her voice trembling. I didn't need convincing. I floored the gas, the car jolting forward down the uneven road. But the sense of dread only grew. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing us, but the road behind was empty. Then, just as we rounded a bend, the car jolted violently. There was a sickening crunch, and the engine sputtered and died. No, I muttered, turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. "We're not stopping here," Elena said. Her voice panicked. "We can't stay here." I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Elena tried hers. Same result. We were stranded. And then we heard it, the tapping. It was faint at first, coming from the trees around us. Then it grew louder, faster, more chaotic, as if dozens of unseen hands were knocking on the trunks. "It's them," Elena whispered. "They're here." I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car, my hands shaking. The forest was alive with sound, the tapping, the rustling of leaves, the creak of branches. Shadows flickered between the trees, too fast to catch. "Get back in the car," Elena screamed, but I couldn't move. Something was moving toward us, the tapping growing deafening like a drumbeat in my skull. And then I saw it. The figure from the road, standing just a few feet away, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the shadows, pale and misshapen, their bodies twisted and wrong. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. Elena grabbed me, pulling me into the car and locking the doors. They surrounded us, their faces pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes unblinking. The tapping continued, a relentless, maddening rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figured figures melted back into the trees, leaving us alone in the deafening silence. We didn't wait to find out why. The car started on the next try, and we sped out of there, not stopping until we were miles away. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know what the marks in the dirt meant or why the figures let us go. All I know is that something lives in those woods, something ancient and malevolent. We never went camping again.